Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this interesting discussion this morning, looking at the challenge, attempting to challenge the backlash against the globalization which we've been witnessing, and there'll be a lot more on that during the 2 hours that we've got, or less, I think, than 2 hours. And let me not only welcome those of you who are here, but those of you who are joining us remotely. I think that it's going to be a very interesting discussion, but of course first we are going to be having the presentations by the 4 panelists who are exceedingly knowledgeable in this area and would be coming to it from different aspects. The globalization has really been around in some form or the other for a very long time, but of course within recent years the impact of technology has meant that it could get to a certain level that would have been impossible historically. Of course, during Roman times, during the entire empire, there was trade within the empire. The modern globalization, of course, is not only enabled by technology, the advances in shipping, refrigeration, all of this, which makes this possible, but there's another element, because globalization now is different in certain ways from what it was before, because it is not just about the liberalization and free circulation of the goods, but the actual integration of the processes at a global level. And one of the things which I think later on we are going to be doing would be looking at a recent publication on global value chains. The attacks on globalization, of course, come largely within the recent years, largely from 2 areas. Those who feel that they have lost out as a result of changes in comparative advantage, etc., though they are those are sort of the Rust Belt type, where there has not been accommodation or adaptation, so they are poorer. So you get the opposition both at the level of unions, the workers, etc., but also governments, where countries themselves have not sought to adapt, and they are getting poorer, so they fight back against this. But then you also get those who see problems associated with globalization, though they are not coming specifically from globalization, but they are almost incidental, often problems that are associated with exploitation of workers, because that is enabled, problems of exploitation of the environment, etc. So you have a mix of reasons why there is this opposition to globalization. Putting things in perspective would be our first speaker this morning, Dr. Mendes Para, who is with the ODI here. He's a trade economist, and since we're talking globalization, it's very interesting that his area of study is in the most sensitive of the trade areas, which is agriculture. And as an Argentinian, I'm sure that what has happened to Argentinian beef over the years would be something that he would be very sensitive to. He has been involved with the global negotiations, the WTO level, both in agriculture as well as NAMA. So I would first want then to give him the floor to present his overview of the issue. So Max, you've got the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much all for coming and for listening to me. Well, yes, I think that what I would like to start is a bit of how you place trade within this globalization backlash. What is not definitely the only dimension of this globalization backlash. It includes other dimensions that consider from the cultural aspects to also the immigration, but also I think trade is one of the most visible one, and is an element that is particularly under attack by these popular leaders and this rhetoric against globalization. It is particularly an aspect that is easily to link with the foreign, with those aspects, and is in that sense constitute an easy and available direct excavatory goat for this rhetoric. I think there are many studies that are looking into understanding what are the reasons behind, specifically from the trade aspects behind the globalization backlash. We can name a few. Clearly, technological change happening in the last decades or so has played a role where these changes might have, rather than have a more complementary role to labor, may have been starting to substitute some labor or not. And some of these changes might have been induced or stimulated by the trade. So it's the connection between trade and technological change. That probably trade has actually generated the condition for a further technological change. Clearly, from the economics analysis, there has been what I would say a lack of emphasizing of the cost that probably trade adjustment are. I think that in that sense, and in terms of critique to the economy, self-critique would be to be more honest in the communication of the effects of trade. But as a consequence of that, in part, must be a lack of domestic policies associated to deal with this trade adjustment. So basically, these start to things to generate a feeling against trade in many countries, not only in developed countries, but actually, we will say, also in developing countries as well. At the same time, probably, well, you are very well, the dismantlement of the welfare state in across the world, in the developed, but also in many developing countries, has also played a role in generating these conditions. But also, I want to stress that in this anti-globalization feeling that takes this attack to some of the multilateral rules and multilateral organizations is the poor record of the compliance of the rules, specifically by the developed countries. So there is research that has been done by, for example, Simon Evnet, that have been tracking how G20 countries have been complying with the multilateral rules. And there, where you can see is that actually they have not only they have not complied, but also they have an attitude of let's try to get this and they try to get away with it. I mean, this idea of not complying because to try to take an advantage of that. So I think that kind of things has also affected into this globalization backlash. So what sort of how is this manifested in the trade area. What are specifically the things that we are saying in a specific part of policies that we are seeing that is effective? First, we are seeing a proliferation of binational provisions across the world. I mean, it's a sort of programs to enhance the increase of the domestic value added as a policy per se. I mean, particularly to increase the share. I mean, how much of the product is made domestically. There have been threats to increase tariff and sort of border adjustment taxes. So we hear Trump talking about big tax. I mean, all the time he said big tax, not only against foreign firms, but also against American firms that decide to outsource production or to participate in value chains in this fragmentation of production. So you say there is always this threat of a big tax. There is also an increase on the focus on intra-regional trade as a policy objective. So it's nothing wrong with increase the trade with your neighbors, but when it becomes an objective, a policy objective, that is something that you need to be careful that, because easily you can enter into what is called the trade diversion type of effects, where you are replacing efficient producers by inefficient local or regional producers. This is something that is particularly acute in many developing countries, as we see in Africa. This idea of increased intra-region trade as an objective, not as a tool. As I said, well, there is a direct undermining and attack of the multilateral organizations, and a sort of increase the bilateral approaches, but focus more with a sort of mercantilism approach. I mean, it's this idea of bilateral, but this thing of, and we hear it all the time from Trump, this idea is that Germany is making a lot of out of America and of the Chinese without having this sort of interpretation of trade as a sort of a zero-sum game is quite typical. So how value chains fit into this? And this is important because value chains has been a sort of emergent of this globalization process in the last 25 years, we can say. I mean, together with the information and communication revolution, the policies, the agreements, not only in terms of tariff, but many deep integration agreements that have worked into harmonizing regulations, working in the regulatory framework, have facilitated the emergence of this value chain phenomenon, this fragmentation of production, where production lines, production processes are split into different countries regionally, but I would say, particularly in the case of developing countries, they tend to have a global perspective. The information technology has allowed, on the other hand, basically the possibility of controlling and monitoring this production process, and actually that many of the links of the chain are participating into forward or backward linkages by monitoring those chains. So actually, this is no longer the sort of ship and forget type of approach, but basically a sort of participation in a complex process. Developing countries, in particular, have been very involved in this process, where in their cases, no more just this sort, as I said, the ship and forget of raw materials to say, send iron ore, and I forget about that, this is a problem of the producer, but actually they are participating into this value chain, how they have transformed many of their production processes to meet the requirements of the production chains. I mean, these are Tesco or Waitrose that are participating in going into the providers and tell them, well, we need the production to have these and these characteristics. The product needs to be these characteristics. So it's not just they are involved into the production process. In other cases, they also have managed to manage some of the value chains. So it's not just that they are being managed by a store of a supplier in destination country, but also in many cases they have managed to control or to monitor these chains, primarily in chains that are oriented to supply the respective regions. In some cases, they have managed actually to upgrade some functions and some products. So from the standard provision of, let's say, fruits or vegetables, they managed to upgrade the production process. And clear examples we can say in Vietnam, where they are, for example, now they are working into the design of vehicles. They are no longer just assembling vehicles, but now there are many design of vehicles that is done in Vietnam, for example. And the other thing, in contrast, that is probably different in developing countries is, generally, there is some that says that that value chains tend to have a more regional approach. This idea of regional factories, factory Europe, factory Asia, factory US, but that probably applies more to developed countries in products like vehicles or electronics, for example. However, when we are considering the value chains in which the developing countries participate, they are truly global. We are seeing products produced in Africa that are marketed in the UK, textiles and garments from Bangladesh, etc. So in the case of developing countries, this has a truly global dimension. So what does it mean, the globalization backwards means in the context of this organization of production? Clearly, the protectionism in a single link of the chain will affect the competitiveness and the productivity of the whole chain. So it's no longer a thing that if someone puts a tariff, I can try to find an alternative destination. This will require a complete re-engineering of the chain. This is like putting a door or a barrier within a factory. You need to completely change the way of that you organize production. This also have an effect, a knock-on effect on the rest of the member of the chain. So a measure, a tariff, or a protectionist measure into a link will have effect into the direct affected, but also they will knock on into the rest of the countries. And also the effect spread into the domestic market, as the domestic firms also participate in this value chain even when they are not directly trading. So clearly the globalization backlash goes deeper into the trade, but also into the domestic economies of the countries involved. So I think there is in general a view of that, just to summarize that globalization, this globalization backlash is a bit not sustainable in the sense that given that these globalization forces are too strong, in a sense, have been operating in the last 20 and 25 years, and they have affected the production process so deeply, they said that this globalization backlash will be a transitory effect that will be forget, and at some points the globalization forces will become stronger. Others seeing that actually many firms are starting to reorganize their localization strategies, assuming that there will be clearly a retreat of globalizations. Whatever the possibilities, clearly the damage in the short run is expected to be serious, and it's specifically on the value chains that is need to be specific attention and a specific care on the way that this is dealt. This is no longer the way that protectionisms operate before, but this protectionism will go deeper into the economic structures of the countries involved. So I think the value chain analysis need to be, and the fragmentation analysis need to be carefully understood at the time of designing policies to deal with these aspects of the globalization backlash.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Max. I think you really have set the scene for the discussion later on, and the very last area that you have touched on, I think, has some very serious policy implications, because a lot of the authorities that support and advocate this protectionist move do not probably always appreciate the impact that this will be having on their own national production. And I think you're clearly establishing that link was important. We will come back to that theme, I'm sure. And now we will have Dr. Keane, who is Economic Advisor at the Commonwealth Secretariat. She is responsible for or involved in global advocacy and looking at emerging trade issues and supporting the global trade architecture. So I think who better to work on issues achieving the sustainable development goals via trade. She is really the right person, and I think that Jody was very much involved in the publication that has just been completed, and I'm sure in her presentation she will speak a bit more about this. Jody.
Thank you.
Incidentally, everyone will have 10 minutes. I did give Max a bit of leeway, but that was only because he was setting the scene.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted that you've all managed to join us at this early start. And just thank you also to the panellists. Daria is on her day off, actually, so we're really delighted that you could join us. And Nigel, thank you so much too. And Max and I have been working together. I think we began kind of last year, and we started to try and kind of pull out and look at the new GBC databases that had arisen, and try and pull out and look at a more kind of disaggregated level, look at how our members in the Commonwealth are positioned in GBCs. So I'll just add a disclaimer that everything that I'm saying is they're my own views, and they're not the views of the Secretariat. So I am just going to run through you today, kind of just touch on some of what Max has discussed in terms of the backlash that we're witnessing now on globalisation. And then I'm going to move on to talk about the implications for our members, the majority of which are small island developing states. And then I'm going to talk about the effects of this backlash on GVC participation at the global level and also at the regional level. And then I'm going to talk about the future and potential future fragmentation, because that's what we've been looking at the Secretariat. And then I'm going to wrap up. So as Max has discussed, we're seeing this backlash, and it's really happened since the global financial crisis of 2008. And we now have, we now know that there's been a rather profound shift in the relationship between the trade and growth. This trade growth nexus has changed, and it's quite dramatic. So all kind of governments are grappling with this. And at the same time, since the crisis, there's been a kind of shift amongst the dominant hubs of global economic activity. And some of this is presented in our Future Fragmentation publication. So since the crisis, the share of Asia in global production networks has continued to rise, whereas the share of the US and EU has continued to decline. And what we've seen is that China's China has kind of shifted towards the use of greater domestic value added in its production. So you've got this shift amongst the three dominant hubs. We've got a profound shift in the trade growth nexus, and we're now, we can see quite visibly that protectionism is on the rise. We've had this recent development at the G20. Some are saying that the trade facilitation measures are kind of counteracting the protectionist measures, but nonetheless, this is where we are at the moment. So what does this mean for our members? Well, most of the members are small island states, and they have highly concentrated export baskets. So, and they have very high trade costs as well, and this is because of structural constraints as well as geographical. So any moves that kind of increase trade costs, this can have very damaging economic and social effects. And some of these effects can be permanent because market shares can change, amongst firms. So I think we have to be very, very live to this, and we also have to confront the fact that we have big challenges in terms of monitoring the increases in protectionism and the effects that they might have on our members. We're kind of really flying blind, so we don't. None of the Pacific or Caribbean are covered in UNCTAD Train's NTB database. We have a lack of information also on services trade restrictiveness measures. So we might know, what's going on at the G20, but we don't really know how that's subsequently, what are the knock-on effects. So we really have a challenge here. So so given these developments, what are the effects on global value chains and regional value chain development? I think Max has touched on the point about the moves towards kind of increasing shares of domestic value added. You've got the kind of Buy America initiatives, and that's been going on for quite some time. More recently, you've got these moves to kind of take back control. But as I think Max pointed out, that these are very mercantilist-style policies, and they can actually turn out to be beggar thyself, because we're in a world of deeply interconnected production networks. So who really has control? It's not that easy to take back control because governments don't have the control over the production in the way that they used to. So this is a challenge. Just as we're kind of flying blind when it comes to protectionist measures, we're relying on perception-based surveys, but we don't really have, more systematic reviews that are needed. We also have a challenge in terms of seeing what the effects are on global and regional value chain development, because we all bought into these new trade and value-added databases after the crisis around 2013, 2012. We had a lot of big reports coming out. Everyone was talking about get into GVCs, and now just a few years later, we're suddenly all pulling back, and we don't know, when will developing countries, will we continue to measure how they participate? We've got questions over UNCTAD's role on measuring trade in value added. Will it continue this? And we have the WTO OECD database, but that doesn't cover developing countries. And we have a World Bank database now, but it uses different definitions compared to OECD WTO. So we kind of have a challenge there too. And this matters because we've got this rise in protectionism, we've got this shift amongst the dominant hubs. So we know that the kind of fragmentation mechanism has entered a new phase, but we still have a challenge in trying to monitor really what's going on. So what we've been trying to do at the Secretariat is we've been trying to kind of take stock over what's happened in recent years, and look more closely and carefully about regarding how our members are participating. And this is in a Future Fragmentation publication that will be available live by the end of this week. I've been promised an e-copy version because we're very environmentally friendly. And there are 4 main sections. We kind of look at the global developments. We also cover commodities. Often in the GVC literature, commodities are just glossed over. We also cover some thematic issues, trade and tax issues that includes there. And then we also run through kind of sectoral developments, and then finally we move on to policy perspectives. And this is where, Daria, we're very grateful to your help for us on that section there. But I'm just going to zoom in, because we also, through our work with Max, we've also been trying to undertake more careful kind of disaggregated analysis for the small states in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And this is because often they're lumped together, so it's quite, that's another challenge to trying to look at what exactly is going on. So we've tried to look at what's happened in recent years in the Caribbean, and we know that over time the contribution of the Caribbean's value added to world exports, it has actually declined since 2000. I mean, we know generally the region specialises in services. You've got a few commodity exporters there. But our analysis does suggest that in kind of archetypal GVCs such as textiles and clothing, electrical machinery and fisheries, actually that indicators of GVC participation for those sectors has declined. So that's obviously a concern. But again, we only have the data. The data is already quite outdated, and we've gone through a global trade slowdown. We've had a rise in protectionism. So we don't know what's happened really since. And that is something that I think we should all be rather worried about. There is some evidence of regional value chain development also. It does suggest that Trinidad and Tobago is playing a role there, but again, the picture's quite mixed, and I think we have to be very cautious as well, the quality of the data, and that's something that really does need to be addressed. So just to kind of wrap up, trading relationships are being radically transformed, and I don't think that's going to stop. Actually, we've got new technologies coming on stream. I think blockchain, Daria might talk a little bit about that, but these are innovations that have the potential to further radically transform trading relationships. And we've got the rise of global value chains. It does bring to the fore kind of issues around control. Who really controls? How can you take back control? How do you govern? You need to adapt your trade governance kind of structures to this new reality. And I think we also have to kind of zoom in and focus a bit more on this debate on technological advancement and the kind of impacts. Because if you need to constantly upgrade, and you're upgrading economically and socially, and this is about technological advancement, and so it does mean that you need a different sort of institutional setup, and I don't think we've really got that right. I think what we're seeing at the moment is a kind of reflection of some of the inadequacies really of trade governance. So I'll just conclude with the an emphasis on we really do need to get a handle on these data constraints. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. So it's clear that there's still a lot of work to be done, and we're all looking forward to that publication. As you say, it will be out by the end of the week. I was quite interested to hear the phrase that you used. I don't know whether you just invented it, but if you did, congratulations on beggar myself. It was. It might well go down in a few, maybe in 50 years' time, just as when we speak of the policies of the 30s, yes, there was the other phrase then. Maybe this might be the phrase that will demonstrate or maybe indicate the unintended consequences of some of the policies. Well, we next have Daria, whom you have introduced to a certain extent. Daria is with the World Bank. She's been involved in. She's an economist in trade and competitiveness, global practice quite a mouthful, that group in the bank. She has been working on a number of issues before in this area. She was previously with the European Central Bank, I understand, OECD, when I think when we probably did meet. We're very grateful to Daria as well for having taken her day off to be here with us. So Daria, you've got the floor.
4th of July. But I'm not American, so it's fine. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. The topic I will focus on is whether it's more difficult to join global value chains and to upgrade, to develop from it, given this new context, which I like to call the two catastrophe scenarios. Either everything moves to China or everything moves back to the US/the UK, Europe, whatever. What I do believe, and I think I'm an informed optimist, is that, in fact, we will not see any of these catastrophe scenarios, but there will be as many challenges that are being created as opportunities. And I would try to walk through where some of the opportunities for the new developers that interpret the current mega trends of our times, which is globalization and ICT, where can they find these opportunities? So the first is that, and in doing that, I actually will challenge a bit three let's say, common way of thinking, at least in the news, right? One is that GVC are now more established. Some, even in my organization, speak about the GVCs are maturing. There is less opportunity for, at least at the extensive margin, for new actors to come in. But then, in fact, when we really try to look at the very detailed trade data, we see two things. First of all, there's been a general trade slowdown, but those parts of trade that we can more closely connect to GVC trade actually are the ones that have slowed the least. So they remain the most dynamic part. And the GVCs are actually working in the knowledge sphere. So they're moving away from the pure manufacturing and embracing services. And that's why a lot of what I will say will include services, but not as an abstract element or separated from manufacturing, but really thinking that services manufacturing increasingly are very interdependent, and in fact, it's a bit of a statistical artifact to keep thinking of them in a separate way. The second element that says that GVCs are maybe not more established is that we heard a lot about reshoring, but actually the figures, they are very small. And so I really have the sense that a lot of the hype around reshoring is overestimated, inflated. So this is one point. The second point is that countries that are deeply involved in GVCs, so we tend to think that you enter in GVCs through low wages. But actually, new evidence from the OECD and evidence from other authors, old also of some years, shows that the countries that are deeply involved in GVCs are not those that have low wages, but those that have low unit labor costs, which is a completely different agenda. And finally, ICT innovation. Of course, we've been used for the past 40, 50, 60 years since basically the container revolution came in and then all the waves of trade liberalization to innovations that were one way, basically, they were trade-creating innovations. So they were just creating more connectivity and lower costs. And now we have two types of innovations. Some that that foster a bit of concentration, and so they are a bit trade defeating, but also plenty of other innovations that are trade creating. And so these innovations that are trade creating are those that really push for the integration of data and manufacturing. And that's where the data services come in as an important element. So for instance, cloud computing is one of the elements where actually I like to say that it can neutralize geography and gives opportunities to unfair geographically positioned places, because it basically allows, it doesn't require agglomeration to actually deliver productivity effects and employment effects. And then the fourth point is that, linked to this, is that a skillful strategy that combines services with manufacturing and with data can actually slow down premature industrialization. So paradoxically, moving away from services, as some policymakers in some countries sometimes question themselves, and one is the Philippines that says, have we been going too far on services? And we say, no, that's the most right thing you could do, but leverage on that. And so basically working on that, it's important. It's important also because from getting right the services economy, and in particularly the ICT-enabled services, and understanding well how this integrate with manufacturing at home and abroad, can give scope for expansion in good jobs and higher value added. And one of the reasons is that the services economy faces still many more barriers than the manufacturing sector. And that's particularly the case in professional services. So what do we need to do? What policies are really needed for that? I think, first of all, a philosophical approach that entering global value chains is not a panacea, is not the silver bullet, and then things will happen automatically, but is the beginning of a journey. And imitating old developers doesn't really help much. So nobody will reproduce the journey that China did or the Asian tigers before. Really, it's a question of finding their own journey by understanding what are the competitive advantages now and how to leverage the global economy and specialize on the comparative advantages to build increasingly capabilities. And so I think that if we want to generalize what needs to be done, I think there could be a 4+4 strategy of pro-investment, pro-skills, pro-jobs, pro-growth, adapted to the needs of this new century, of the 21st century. So the first and important thing is to really understand and invest in digital technologies and connectivity in the right way. And that means that countries have really to try to understand how to achieve a balance between access to world-class infrastructure and services and developing their own ICT industry. And this is a difficult balance to reach. I don't think this is easy, but it's a priority where countries have to have their own digital strategy, have to have their ICT strategy, they have to understand what infrastructure to develop and what infrastructure not to develop. For instance, data centers. A lot of countries in the developing world are still trying to develop data centers, but data centers are pretty useless in the times of cloud computing. So, and so we can think in disaggregated on a lot. The second is to leverage GVCs and create the right enabling environment for them. And to me, the main important things, of course, at different levels of engagement, there are different types of priorities, but basically it boils down to upgrade infrastructure and connectivity, ensure regulatory certainty. Regulatory uncertainty kills any type of investments, and in particular, when there are long-term engagements as those created in global value chains. Working on competition policy, it's extremely important, and enhancing the absorptive capacities, both of the public framework and of the domestic firms, so that basically the domestic ecosystem can intercept the additional demand that is created through GVCs. They have to create the supply by creating the right absorptive landscape. The third element in this strategy is to invest in human capital and to reduce the barriers to knowledge. So mutual recognition to attract professionals and talent helps in services, but helps even more into leapfrogging. Because again, entering into GVCs, will not be done anymore in the traditional way of entering at the low end with low value added jobs and then slowly moving up, but probably a lot of the opportunities will come into models where there will be leapfrogging to create, leapfrogging that will be based basically on a mix of indigenous innovation, targeting the domestic demand as an incubation space to then become globally and acquire the right foreign technology, which combined with the domestic knowledge can create unique solutions that can be first sold domestically, but then also exported if they are good to face the global competition. And finally, the last is to focus on workers and citizens besides jobs and firms. So it is about linking productivity to distribution and economic impacts to the environmental and social impacts as a business model for sustainability, and the only one that gives this long-term space to have the development journey really start and bring to some results. I would stop, yeah. Did I make it within the 10 minutes or not really?
One more.
Okay, perfect.
But thanks very much for that, Daria. There are lots of important policy prescriptions and guidance you've provided, and I was quite interested to hear you speak of the false separation that is made between the production of goods and of services within the value chain. And unfortunately, lots of people just look at those two things as being completely separate. But I think that your approach would be quite valuable to policymakers. Our last, we've now had presentations from persons outside the policy making. Those persons. So now we'll be moving to our last speaker, who would be someone actually involved with policy making. I would suspect, because he is with the government, and this is Nigel Gwyn Evans, who works with the DTI in South Africa and is responsible for the African industrialization agenda. So he will be able to put all of those ideas, I guess, into a very, very concrete way. And I don't know whether you might also have been associated with this publication. But anyway, you'll let us know. Nigel.
Thank you. No, I wasn't involved in the publication, and it really is an excellent document. So perhaps just to give a brief background, it's most intimidating being here because, for one, I have Sheila Page here, who I worked for in 1992, I think, or 1993, and she had me working on global trade data on old DOS operating systems, and at least it was post-punch cards, but it was still quite a challenge. And secondly, I have Brendan Vickers here, who worked at the DTI for a lot longer than I did. So I spent 20 years at a subnational level, working on cluster policies and sectoral development, and I've been at the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa for the 2 years. But it's a great pleasure to be here, and perhaps just a few thoughts. Firstly, just on South Africa, I think, and particularly with what Max was saying around this globalisation backlash, I think we are, as South Africa, I think we're in it is a challenging environment. We've just slipped into a technical recession. And I think the general feeling is that's largely because of our political circumstances which we find ourselves. And Sheila was also asking me, has it affected investment? And it very definitely has. So it is it's a tough time for South Africa. We've just been through, obviously, a serious drought over the past 2 years. We've been impacted on by our political factors. So it is a very challenging space. I think also we have probably a paradigm of certainly perhaps a bit of an inward focus with significant, we're certainly looking at defending, as my minister puts it, defending the policy space that we have in terms of our tariff trade remedies that we apply. I think, as Max also mentioned, a strong push around localization, particularly in terms of our big infrastructure drive, and certainly the use of targeted incentives. We have I'm part of the sectoral team, although my focus is very much on Africa. My colleagues focus on key sectors, which I don't think in itself is a negative thing. We're really trying to use perhaps a smarter industrial policy and being more targeted, more focused around our core sectors. But I think we do have a real challenge in that around capacity. And certainly as a government, I sense whenever I come to Europe, I just sense this much more, perhaps not quite at the moment in Britain, but I do sense just the sheer sort of, there's a lot more capacity available than we have certainly in South Africa, and we are stretched as officials. So we on the run. Particularly those who have the capabilities tend to get stretched probably and stretch themselves in too many directions. So we're under pressure, and I think that detracts from our ability to use, let's say, smart industrial policies in the way that we should. So that's just an inward focus. I think as South Africa also, we're focusing increasingly on the region and our trade figures. And I think I'm very interested to see the latest trade figures, because Africa, for South Africa, became the most important trading partner. It overtook Europe and China about 2 years ago, but I suspect, given what's happened in the subcontinent, we've probably slipped back slightly. So in terms of the importance of Africa. The big challenge, obviously, is that we export about £20 billion worth of goods to the region. We import about £4 billion worth. So it is a significant trade imbalance that we have, and I think I want to touch on that because it does have a significant effect on the region as a whole, and I think the political dynamic that is there at the region. So maybe just moving to, I know Jody has been particularly involved in SACU. I've focused on the South African Customs Union. I've focused very much on SADC, the SADC region, and I've been very involved in the last 2 years on what we're calling the SADC industrialization strategy. To some extent, this is the culmination of many years of work around trying to create a stronger regional market, and now the sense is that we need to, let's say, enjoy the fruits of regional integration. And I think, to a large extent, that's not wrong. And talking, maybe taking Max's point, I think for Africa, regional trade only, interregional trade only represents 12% of total trade. So I think in that sense, there's nothing wrong with trying to create stronger regional markets, in the sense that for Africa, it's very much around redressing perhaps the colonial heritage that perhaps Africa has had with the rest of the world, and obviously focus very much on getting extractives out. But my Marxist masters, I'm not going to elaborate anymore on that one. But I think I think in trying to create better regional markets and trying to increase interregional trade flows is, in the African context, not a negative thing, negative issue. And I think to some extent I suppose the theory is that we will move from trying to create stronger national, regional, and then move into global value chains. And perhaps a quick example, as part of the SADC industrial strategy, a key focus is on agri, mining, and pharmaceutical value chains. And I'm really not convinced personally that certainly on the pharma value chains we're going to get great benefits out of that. I think any growth in pharmaceutical investment is probably largely going to happen in South Africa for a number of reasons. I think also in terms of mining, trying to strengthen mineral value chains, there's a significant focus obviously on supporting the backward and forward linkages coming out of there. I think there are many challenges why the benefit there is going to be limited. But I do think particularly on the agri value chains, I think there are significant opportunities there for growth. And I think particularly we've done quite a bit of work in the past few years, and there's been many studies done on particularly South Africa's role in retailer value, in its retail sector, in South African retailers moving very strongly into the region. And certainly as we stand, the bulk of that input comes from South Africa. There's very limited local resourcing. And I think there's a very strong case to be made for supporting initially national, local supplier development programs into retailer chains, looking at the full set of logistics chains, looking at supplier upgrading, looking at key facilities that will enhance access to the South African and other retailers, of course. I think out of that set, then trying to promote those that have an opportunity to feed into regional and then into global value chains. And there's some excellent programs that are now starting to gain traction. There's a new World Bank program in Zambia. It's a $40 million upgrading program over 4 years, specifically for suppliers into retailer chains. I think these are the sorts of programs that are going to start to gain traction. I think at the SADC level, there's probably, in terms of this industrial strategy, we have this industrialization strategy, a very strong focus, as I've mentioned, on upgrading into not just regional but global value chains. My concern is around questions of sovereignty. And I think South Africa, as I mentioned in the beginning, we do play a very dominant role. We've seen quite a backlash against us from countries like Zimbabwe and Zambia, for example. And I think this could, to some extent, break down our ability at a SADC-wide level to be able to create these regional economies that we're hoping to. So perhaps in the end, it is going to be, I think, the wins, and I think it's well articulated in the Commonwealth report. I think boiling it down to a strong focus on upgrading, using the instruments such as cluster development, focusing on key capabilities and centers of excellence, looking at SPS issues, looking at quality issues. I think working on the ground, building institutional capabilities both inside and outside government, this is what's going to be key. We need stronger institutions in government. And perhaps also just touching on, I think while in our sector units, probably in South Africa, we might have 5 to 10 officials in each sector unit. Across most of our member states, there's probably no sectoral capability whatsoever. So the ability to carry out any nuanced industrial policy is very limited. So perhaps to wrap up, I think we probably as a region moving more shifting to certainly from a policy perspective to a more inward focus, but I think also being very cognizant of the need to move into global value chains ultimately, but a real sense that we need to build our regional economies first, build up regional capabilities, and then with that as a platform, then moving to into more global value chains. But I think the risks are high. I think the politics are challenging, and capacities are very low. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and I think this is very important to place those concepts in the context of the development of national industrialization strategy, and also regional, as you pointed out, in the Southern African region.